G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with the conclusion of the Mindfield regarding racism.
In terms of nationality, understandings of race, in terms of who's an insider and who's an outsider, who is an owner and who is property, right, precedes any notion of a biological taxonomy. But what we've been left with, largely due to the elevation of, I think, the Nazi Holocaust as the primary moment in the history of racism, we've been left with this understanding of racism as only being about biological difference, which allows anybody who doesn't buy into that, and the majority of us deny thinking that we're in some sense biologically superior to anybody else. So if you don't agree with that, you can say, well, I'm not racist, but you still think that, immigration has gone too far, or Muslim people pose a threat, or we need to be scared of asylum seekers, and so on and so forth. And you say explicitly, but I'm not racist, I'm just being commonsensical.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. Okay. I mean, this just opens up a whole sort of huge area, I think, of inquiry. And let me just try to not boil things down at all, but let me just sort of hive off one small thing here. I mean, one of the points that I think both of you have raised in different contexts, and I think it's absolutely vital, is that if we simply reduce racism to be, if you like, someone who is in possession of racist sentiment, someone who feels a particular way towards particular people, then that makes the seizure of an alibi. Oh, of course I'm not racist, or I'm not racist, but that sort of very familiar now trope. That then makes that possible or feasible. And I think one of the things that, and again, you can both correct me if I'm wrong, but that's then motivated, I think, both of you to try to define the response to racism, or the diagnosis of what racism in fact is, away from moral terms. That somehow moralizing the problem of racism is muddying the waters. It's kind of getting in the way of a more accurate diagnosis of what it is exactly that's going on here.
Absolutely, because I think what happens is as soon as you bring morality into it, then you're accused of moralizing by pointing out where racism exists. And what am I doing when I point out that racism exists? I'm talking about the differentials in life expectancy for Aboriginal people. I'm talking about the differentials in terms of the incarceration rate. You mentioned Ms. Du earlier. Ms. Du called the police because she was a victim of domestic violence and ends up jailed for unpaid fines. We know that white people in this country are not jailed for unpaid fines. So that's what I'm talking about. That. So obviously, it's morally wrong to do that. But then I can say, but I don't agree with that. And that excises me from, the complicity with that system, which shines a positive light on me and shines a negative light on somebody like Ms. Du. And I think we need to start talking about how we're all complicit in this system. But at the same time, we need to move away from this notion that if I express if I do what I call wear the badge of anti-racism, so call myself an anti-racist, that in itself is sufficient. We need to actually transform our behavior because, as Karen and Barbara Field say, for example, they say racism is not a state of mind like bigotry or prejudice, for example. It is an action. And what are the daily actions that we're all explicitly or implicitly involved in, which reproduce racial hierarchies of various types?
And I think that goes alongside the phenomenon which is sometimes called race blindness, the unwillingness to name race or to recognize race, which is, of course, a social construction. But the idea that we solve this problem by not talking about it, by not acknowledging it, and that the person who says, well, I don't see race, is somehow anti-racist, whereas in fact that is a perpetuation of racism, because the person who says that they don't see race is preserving the status quo, which is racist. So I think there is, and I think that has been at the heart of a lot of anti-racist education, a lot of the kind of general feeling around what is appropriate in relation to racism, that unwillingness to name it, the idea that to say white, that a person is white or that a person is black, that is a racist act. Yeah.
And in fact, I mean, one of the things that interests me about an argument that you've made, Joe, is quite apart from distancing ourselves, if you like, from racist acts, instead of, branding oneself or badging oneself as being not racist, one of the things that you've been urging as a proper response, if you like, to the history of complicity is not running away from white supremacy, but instead fully owning our complicity both in the perpetration of the acts, but also the historical benefit that has then accrued as the result of those acts themselves.
Yes, and look, everything I know about my own white supremacy has really come from education by people of colour who have educated me and pointed that out to me, because I think, as it stands, part of whiteness is an inability to see the implications of one's actions and to understand where they come from and what they're doing. But it has become increasingly clear to me that those of us who are part of this community, this category that can identify as white and can take on those characteristics, are perpetuating its injustices. And the first step is to own that.
Sorry, may I say, I think there's a useful term here from Gloria Becker. She calls it white innocence. And I think it's based, what she's trying to explain is that there's not the need to know, right? There's a racial illiteracy at the heart of how many white people, if not most white people, think about how race affects them and others. We don't need to know this. And race is always a topic that is supposed to be for people of color. It's, as it was put to me one time, your special interest topic, black people's or Jewish people or Muslim people's special interest topic. It's not something that concerns us. And unless we become racially literate in the history that has made us superior and continues to ensure that we are conferred the privileges of whiteness, then it will be impossible to dismantle systemically.
Okay. I'm keenly aware that this particular part of the conversation may well have to spill over into the podcast, and I realize I'm kind of opening Pandora's box here. But there is and I'm coming to this as someone with a profound interest in moral philosophy, so, pardon me for shifting into that vernacular. But it does seem to me that we are left with a bit of a problem here, that on the one hand, I think we rightly minimize, we rightly cast aspersions on those symbolic or individual acts that really do little more than assuage one's conscience as a response to racism. Okay, I think we're right to critique that. But then on the other hand, one of the responses in political philosophy to those acts of, say, individual non-racism has been to shift things into more of a Rawlsian register and say really the only way of countering the persistence of racial disadvantage is to engage this sort of widespread reordering of society, to institutionalize various forms of social justice. In other words, to make the response to the persistence of racism to make it a response without a moral agent, to make it a political and institutional or systemic response. Now, I've got certain critiques of Rawls here, because I don't think you can altogether do without agency. But is there something in between those two? Because on the one hand, you just have the individual response. On the other hand, you have the response without agency. It seems to me I think there is something in the middle, but I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah, in the paper that I recently wrote, J.L. Garcia, as a philosopher of race, talks about this, and I think he does it relatively usefully. I have some critiques of his ultimate conclusions about racism, because I think they lend themselves towards universalization, i.e. anybody can be racist ultimately, and I don't agree that that's true, because I think that's ahistorical. But I think there are two things that have to go hand in hand, which is systemic change, which actually requires a shift in power. So who's in power, who leads us on these questions, right? So we can't continue with the status quo and expect an end to racial injustice, but also we cannot take out one's individual role in this.
Well, that's it for the live broadcast of the Mindfield. Jo Cruikshank is Senior Lecturer in History at Deakin University. She's joined me today as our guest co-host. And Alana Lenton is Associate Professor of Cultural and Social Analysis at Western Sydney University. You can, of course...
Okay. Well, yeah. Kind of difficult to say that racism, unquote, is an entirely social construct, because there's so many people who've done experiments with babies and found that babies prefer faces of the same basic racial mix as their own or of their parents. So Asian babies prefer looking at Asian faces, and African babies prefer looking at African faces, and Australian babies preferred looking at Australian faces until Australia became quite the melting pot that it has become. But, you know, not much I can do about that. We might have a bit less magnification, just so as we can fit the globe in as well. Let's see if we can focus the shelf out of the way with the angle of the dangle. These bit less, and there we go. We have the ranting globe as well as the wind turbine rotor. Yeah, because Australia was a British convict settlement, and they showed up with guns and they believed in terra nullius, and the very first thing they did was sort of release the sheep and potato brigade, and the first thing the sheep do is eat all the food plants that the humans eat. And then they eat the food plants that the prey animals eat, and then the prey animals get shot instead of being occasionally speared. So it was pretty easy to tell the second or third boatload of white people who came out from Europe that, oh, the Aborigines didn't live around here, see, there aren't any here. As the Aborigines are retreating further and further away from the devastation wrought by the EuroPeons. And for some reason, destroying the ecology of the biosphere in order to reap short-term profits is considered increasing the productivity, you know, like squeezing the tits of the land to make it give more milk. Robbing the beehives more often to get more honey. And that's considered a really good idea, although it all started 10,300 years ago at Göbekli Tepe, and it created a desert. And the survivors of the civilization there covered the place up with sand, went back to trying to farm goats. The people who made the money out of creating the desert at Göbekli Tepe, they took their running money and they went and they paid somebody else to let them destroy their bit of land on the idea that, look, I'm so rich, I know better than you, let me do this. And, you know, like, I'll pay you to let me have this land, then I'll pay you to cut down the trees, and then I'll pay you to work on the farm, and then I'll pay you to irrigate it. And then when the well water salinates the soil, I'll take the money I made from growing the grain and selling it in the market, and I'll piss off and I'll be rich and you'll be living on a salty desert. So I don't see why European white civilization is considered to be best practice anywhere in the world. All it's done is create a fucking desert and then run away and make, you know, somebody else give their land to the rich bastard who created the desert. It's a horrible scheme. And a lot of it runs on the idea of the proprietary limited company, so that the people who get rich can't be sued for the damage they cause. So the Europeans have stolen the whole world and destroyed it on the run. Raid, smash and grab is the way of the Europeans. And part of it is to convince the natives everywhere in the world that the European way is world's best practice. You know, when England took over India, India made 29% of the world's gross domestic product in 1700. In 1900, India was still making 19%. When England left, India was a poster child for poverty in the world. But England got rich out of the British Empire and the Indian Raj. Funny that. It's silly. I think we should redefine what being Australian is, and it doesn't involve trashing everything today and eating your grandchildren's lunch yesterday. That's not the essence of Australianism. To be an Australian, you have to look after the land, almost as a religious obsession, because that's how people lived here for 60,000 years. So the idea that white supremacists are anything but completely wrong drives me to rant. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.